Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this DPAS webinar. We are going to start in a couple of minutes. We just like to give people 1 or 2 minutes after the time to join in and make sure as many people as possible are able to get the entire webinar. So just give us a minute, please. Thank you very much.
Should we sing a little song in the meantime?
Yes. I think that might be the ethical thing to do.
GDPR to the tune of YMCA. Yay, numbers are climbing.
Yes, indeed. So I'm just going to share my screen now as well, so we can. Let's stop here. Okay, it's 1 minute past the hour, and we are going to start now. Thank you again, everyone, for joining this webinar from the Data Privacy Advisory Service. We're very glad to have you here. We're sure it's going to be a very interesting event for all of us, because clearly data ethics is something that, is as essential as it sometimes is confusing and unclear. So that's why we have an expert here, Rowenna, to take us through exactly how to do it right. So just quickly, I'll introduce myself, then Rowenna will introduce herself, and we'll go straight to the meat of the matter. So to start with, my name is Ademola Adekunbi. Kunbi is fine, and probably easier for you as well. And I work as a consultant at DPAS, and my role is primarily, with regard to audits, international transfers, and general advisory for our clients. Rowenna, could you please give us an overview of what you do?
Sure, I am Rowenna Fielding, aka Miss IG Geek (brackets limited), and I'm a professional data protection nerd who recently also got into data ethics. I am a certified data ethics professional with the Open Data Institute, and I basically help organizations stitch together law, technology, and humanity as best they can. So I've been doing a lot of training, a lot of consultancy, a lot of research on data ethics lately, and wash my mouth out for saying this, but I actually think it's more fun than data protection. Never thought I'd hear myself say that.
Thank you very much, Rowenna. That's a bit, I'm sure that's very controversial, right? But we can come to that later. And I like the fact that you've gone right into it, right? Talking about law, ethics, and risk. And I think that would take us to the first slide, which is, obviously the second slide, and talking about what exactly data ethics is, how do those things intersect when you are in an organization trying to make sure you're doing the best you can, both on the data protection side and on the data ethics side.
Yeah, so I mean, ethics is a really big, fuzzy concept. There are centuries of debate and scholarship looking at what it means and what it's for and how to do it. So the first thing to know about data ethics is there is no one single right answer that you're going looking for. Data ethics is about your organization's feelings about what's acceptable and what's not. Acceptable to the organization, acceptable to the people you're dealing with, to society at large. So it's about whose interests are looked after and whose are not. So I always use this slide in my training. This is the classic moment from Jurassic Park where Dr. Ian Malcolm points out that just because something is possible to do doesn't necessarily make it a good idea to do. And I think if you've seen the movie, we can pretty much all agree that he kind of had a point with that. Yay, making dinosaurs. Oh dear, dinosaurs going to eat us. And obviously data doesn't eat you, but data can be just as dangerous as dinosaurs. There's a tagline for today. So ethics is essentially the study of what the right thing, the good thing, the morally acceptable thing to do is. And that's very distinct from other ideas. We've got a slide about law, ethics, and risk, so I won't get ahead of myself. But ethics is a community sense of what isn't acceptable. And in some disciplines, such as medicine or research, working with vulnerable people, they have formal codes of ethics. There aren't that many formal codes of ethics in data protection, data science, privacy at the moment. There are a whole load of different frameworks and standards for approaching ethics. Key thing, you don't need to have a template pack for a particular framework or standard to start talking about ethics in the organization. So step one of doing data ethics is to sit down and have some challenging conversations with your peers and with management on what does ethics mean in this organization. Ethics is whether you should do something, not whether you can do it, not whether you're allowed to do it, but whether it's really a good idea.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. And I just wanted to add as well that even though, we might disagree on what is more fun between data protection and data ethics, I do think that data ethics is becoming increasingly important to the point where it might actually surpass the black letter law of data protection. That's because if you look at many of the recent laws that have been passed or have been proposed to be passed, the DPDI in the UK, for instance, and India's recent data protection law, they're very risk-based approach. They're very, they give a lot of latitude to organizations to decide how they want to approach data protection, with the caveat that if you were to decide to take it, in a lax manner and something were to go wrong, obviously you would have to bear the brunt of that. But it's not even about, the consequences to your organization. What I'm hearing from you, Rowenna, is that it's about the consequences or potential consequences for the people whose data you hold and process, right? That's where the ethics comes into play. Just because it will potentially, be fun to do, like creating dinosaurs or reanimating dinosaurs, doesn't mean you should, right? And that's going to take us to the next slide, which is that intersection exactly on law, risk, and ethics. So if you were going to crystallize this and make it more practical for us, I know that on this webinar, we have people from, business, we have people from government, we have people from charities. So maybe a couple of examples of where, this would actually be a dilemma that someone might have to sort out in the course of their job.
Absolutely, yeah. So there is let's take targeted advertising because that's always fun to discuss. So there are laws around what can and can't be done when connecting to somebody else's computer over the internet. There are laws about what can and can't be done and how it should be done when working with information that identifies or could identify living humans. That's the law part. Then there's the risk. There's the cost-benefit analysis for the organization. Is it worth it? There's the cost-benefit analysis for the data subjects themselves. Is it worth it to them? Is it more worth it to the organization than it is to them? That's a question to look at. And then there's the risk to wider society as a whole. If you are getting preferential pricing, as in you're getting lower pricing from insurance or financial support or loans because you've got a good credit history, that's great for you. But then that also means that people who don't have a credit history that looks like yours may get higher pricing, unfairly higher pricing, perhaps because of the comparison, because of market forces, which then brings us on to whether that's right or wrong. I do sometimes joke that business ethics is a contradiction in terms, and that's me being cynical, because it doesn't have to be. There's nothing that says a business has to approach every decision based on what's the bare minimum that you have to do and how much can you get away with. It is okay to bring ethics into the conversation. And ethics, as I said earlier, is the question of what's right versus what's wrong. Now, like I mentioned, there's no abstract, perfect truth answer that you can go out and find. Ethics is about feelings. So whether you feel that this is right or wrong, whether other people will feel this is right or wrong. And if you're looking to justify something that you might not feel is necessarily ethical, how strongly you'll be able to do that in the face of people who completely disagree. What I find when starting conversations with organizations about data ethics is how quickly these conversations get derailed into conversations about law and then conversations about risk. That's a really dangerous trap, because when that happens, ethics just quietly slides off the table and slinks out the door. It becomes all about what you're allowed to do, what you might get caught doing, what's worthwhile doing, and what everybody else is doing, without looking at the human consequences, because they don't really come into the law and risk arguments. So I would say step one of data ethics is have conversations about ethics. Step two of data ethics is keep those conversations focused on ethics. Don't get sidetracked by what legislation says, because you should be complying with that anyway. And don't allow business risk to overtake your thinking about human impact.
Thank you. That's very comprehensive. That's clear now. And ultimately, like you say, law should be the baseline, because obviously, if it's a legal obligation, you should be doing it and doing it well to start with. And ethics and risk should then lay on top of that, with ethics being the most important factor. And ultimately, what one might find is that a lot of times being ethical in how you approach using personal data will translate to real benefits in a variety of ways. It will mitigate your risks, because just by being more conscious of the dangers or the hazards. And if you haven't heard Rowenna give her presentation on data hazards, you should. It's a very great presentation, and she has a concept called data hazards, and how you should evaluate that within the context of processing personal data. But ultimately, the point is, if you approach your processing of personal data from that perspective, the likelihood is that by doing that, you will be benefiting the other aspects of your operations and benefiting the organization as a whole. So it's not a cost center, it's not a loss. At the end of the day, it's very likely, even if it is, a cost in the short term, that you would get long-term benefits from it. And crucially as well, your customers, your staff, and everyone else whom you're interacting with, all the stakeholders, would get lots of benefits from it, because their data is going to be secure, their data is not going to be abused. And that in itself, I think, is Rowenna's message. That in itself should be counted as a net positive, regardless of any other factor. So that's very interesting. Thank you very much, Rowenna.
Oh, Kunbi, you've gone on to talking about risk again. I was talking about ethics. Ethics is like character. Character is who you are when nobody's looking and you don't feel the consequences. So I'm a little bit wary of presenting framing ethics within the context of this is good for business, because part of the point of having ethics is that you don't necessarily benefit from caring about other people in a tangible, material and immediate way. But as you say, the wider benefits are there. But it's all about the psychology of altruism. Are we good to other people because we get something from it, or are we good to other people because we want to be good to other people? I've just seen in the chat somebody's raised a question about my talk on data hazards, and I will say to that, hold to the end and wait for the hashtag shameless plug.
Yeah, so hold to the end and you will get more information about how to, hear more from Rowenna. So on that point, Rowenna, I take the point and you're completely correct. Ultimately, like you say, it should be something we do for its own sake, right? Something we do for its own sake, regardless of any other factors. So the next slide takes us into what implementing data ethics looks like. So now we're very clear on what the concept is. We're very certain that it's something that, as Rowenna has said, should be, the focus of your data protection program or your privacy program. So the question then is, how exactly do we implement it? And before we're going to come to metrics, but before we do that, I would like to jump the gun on this slide a bit and just ask, go straight to incentives, because it flows very well, with what we've just discussed. What sort of incentives are there in data ethics? And I ask you this because I have taken your point. I understand what you said, and I agree entirely. But for people on this call who perhaps want to sell that to management, want to sell that to the C-suite, want to, infuse that into the culture at their workplaces, how would you recommend that it be presented for, the maximum effective value?
Well, you know what? That's actually a really tricky one, because if you have to sell the idea of ethics to management, then it's going to be an uphill struggle all the way, because the organization quite clearly is not interested in being ethical for being ethical's sake. Having said that, any improvement, any progress is better than none at all. So incentives, when talking to executive land, kind of pretty much focus around this is how you don't embarrass yourself in public. This is how you don't get a lot of people creating a storm on social media saying you're terrible people and we'll never do business with you again. This is how you stay out of trouble with the regulator, because even if you don't get the details exactly right, if you can demonstrate that you are acting in good faith and trying to do the right thing, while they might tell you to do it differently, they're not going to punish you for acting in good faith and doing the right thing. So there are external incentives for the organization, but within the organization, there also needs to be a hard look at incentives. And a lot of ethics programs falter and fail because the organization's culture and processes and incentive structure are all set up to do the opposite of whatever the ethical thing is. And that's not because people are terrible. That's just because it's a different focus in business. In business, you're looking at operations, you're looking at growth, you're looking at advantage, not really looking at being a nice cuddly human being. Ethics incentives are ways in which an organization encourages its people to be nice human beings and doesn't punish them for doing so. So that's really broad ranging. That means taking a look at a lot of other incentive structures, KPIs and process flows and reward and promotion, that sort of things. And that's really hard to do because getting people to line up with each other and do stuff for the same reasons, I mean, it's a lot like herding cats. But because we're talking specifically about data ethics here, what that is making sure data is used, so generated or acquired, manipulated, analyzed, distributed, handled, in ways that doesn't cause harm to other human beings where harm could have been avoided. So that's the nutshell. And on that, you can build incentives around. And for metrics to marry that definition of data ethics and incentives, you really want to be looking for feedback. So instead of counting things, because you can't count ethics, there's nothing to sum up. What you're looking for is people's feelings and perceptions of what you're doing. So asking the organization's people in properly anonymized ways, do you feel that the organization behaves ethically when it has a choice? Do you feel that as an employee of the organization, your data is treated ethically? Do you feel that the people dealing with the organization would consider it an ethical organization? So people's feelings are the most valuable metrics to use when measuring the effectiveness of your data ethics program.
Thank you very much, Rowenna. That makes a lot of sense. And I just wanted to say as well, I'm very glad that we have a very lively conversation going on in the chat, and just wanted to invite anyone else who wants to add anything, go ahead and put your questions or your comments in the chat. Anything you feel can help any other person on this call dealing with this uphill challenge of getting the C-suite and management on board with data ethics. And any other aspect of this presentation, this webinar, feel free to just chime in the chat. And on that point, I think a couple of people have made some very valid points that are going to be sellable. In addition, of course, to and I know, Rowenna, I can see your expression, so I know I know what you're thinking. In addition to the altruistic aspect of it, right? You can do well while doing good, right? And making that case to management and C-suite, I believe, is possible in a number of ways. Someone has said, Steve has just talked about how ethics is a distinguishing selling point, potentially, depending on what industry you operate in, what products or services you offer. We've seen companies like Apple make privacy a core point in their marketing activities. Whether or not it's completely accurate is up in the air, but if you were a DPO in that organization and you were able to convince management to take privacy seriously, bake it into their products and services, again, the extent to which that is the case is up in the air. And also, boost the bottom line of the company. I would say that's a win-win. So you've satisfied the, your obligations, so to speak, to the organization, its shareholders, management, and everyone else. And you've also satisfied the moral incentives, the moral obligations, right? Like Rowenna has talked about, to the people whose data your organization processes. So, looking for those points of nexus, win-win situations, I think is going to be crucial. But just to be clear, in the event that is a clash, ethics should take priority ultimately, because, and again, another factor is that a lot of times some hazards that organizations face when they process personal data are things that you will face regardless of whether or not you're ethical with personal data. And things like, data breaches, we've had lots of them in recent times where highly sophisticated organizations, are able to breach through defenses of organizations, exfiltrate data, leak that data on the internet, and so on and so forth. But the question then is, between a company or an organization that has been ethical in its data processing and one that has not, which one is likely to, come out on top in terms of reputation, in terms of regulatory exposure, and so on and so forth? It's very likely to be the one that has been ethical. Because if you've been ethical, you've not collected, more data than you need, you've not kept it for longer than you needed to, you've protected it properly, and all of that, you're going to likely be in a better position. But again, ethics for its own sake is a priority. So the next question is barriers, right? We've talked about incentives. What sort of barriers would you say are common, Rowenna, with organizations that you've worked with? And it would help as well if we can get, maybe different contexts, different kinds of organizations. What sort of barriers would you say are very common?
So I have to say that the organizations which have the smoothest transition to a culture of ethical data use are usually the ones that exist to do good, nice things. So, mostly charities, not all charities, but charities that exist to help support and lift up other people are usually those that find adopting the ideas and the culture of data ethics the least troublesome. And those that tend to be the most troublesome, I would say probably the financial industry. But actually, the barriers are all to do with organizational culture. And I have worked with charity organizations that don't have healthy internal culture. They have, really blame-driven, toxic culture where there's bullying and everybody is overworked, underpaid, under-resourced, and trying to shoehorn data ethics into that is just impossible. It cannot be done. What you're doing is you're adding another layer of work to people who have got more than enough on their plates already. So the organizational culture can be a big barrier, and organizations that want to take on data ethics need to understand that they can't just download a template pack, copy paste their names in, and then are good to go. There is so much more to data ethics than paperwork. And if the organization doesn't have the capacity to do that more, have the discussions, make time and space for thinking, then the organization is going to struggle right off the bat. Then again, if the organization is in an industry where unethical behavior is not only kind of rampant, it's sort of the whole basis of the industry, advertising technology. And no, that's not fair, because there are ad tech companies who are developing ethical, privacy-focused solutions. It's just that they're a tiny, tiny minority. The ad tech industry, by and large, is about levering technology in pursuit of psychological advantage, which lends itself quite naturally to stepping over lines as though they don't exist. So barriers are psychological, organizational, sociological, and commercial. And you can't fix those barriers with data ethics content. You can only fix them by getting inside people's heads and making them want to do better.
Thank you. Yes, that's, completely right. And organizational culture, I would say, is the biggest hurdle we've had, in terms of feedback from customers. The organizational culture is, a lot of times, unfortunately, it tends to swing between, we don't care, just do what you need to do, get the documents you need to get, and let's proceed. Or, active opposition in, certain industries like you've mentioned. But, sometimes we do get, organizations that are, switched on, who are very committed to, doing the right thing. And those are the best clients to work with. And those are the best clients who get the best results, from their own efforts as well. So, but ultimately, if you are in an organization where you have organizational culture that's a hurdle to cross to implement data ethics, I'm sure people here know about PrivSec, but we were at PrivSec yesterday, the DPAS team, and there was a very interesting talk about, dealing with organizational culture. And someone talked about how, as DPO, his motto and his advice to new DPOs is that you have to drink a lot of coffee, right? I'm very sorry, I can't remember the person's name now. I would have credited them, but you have to drink a lot of coffee in the sense that you have to, get, face to face with people from around the organization and, persuade them, right? Find out what it is that you can use to persuade them and, do that to make sure they become converts. Like we all have been to Rowenna's, side of things to understand, that the ethics for its own sake is and must be a priority. And even if you have to leverage some of the other things that people have shared here, as long as you stick to that ethical obligation, then, it's a win. So I would say, as a tip, you need to actually engage with people, actually, go out of your way to try to get them on board, recognizing that many times some people are actively opposed, but many times people are merely ignorant, so to speak, and would, do better if they became more aware. Maybe that's, a bit optimistic, yes, but I think that, and people have reported that such efforts have been successful in the past. Do you want to add something to that, Rowenna? You look like you do.
Yeah, so it's actually something that just came up in the chat, which is a really, really good point, and one that I was going to make and forgot, so thank you for the reminder. Organizations, including businesses, often have high-sounding missions and vision statements and values, and those might be a way to encourage more ethical behavior. Absolutely. If an organization has values and mission statements that say, we care about people, then that's the hook on which to hang ethics and data ethics specifically. So by asking challenging questions like, okay, the organization's values say we're going to respect each other's rights. Great. But what you're doing here is something that facilitates disrespecting of people's rights. So, how do you square that? Those conversations, because organizations, the values and the missions, they're sort of PR headlines. But actually using those as a hook to turn them into theories of practice and operational parameters is possibly one of the best ways to get data ethics and data ethics specifically into the conversation. I've also just seen a question there in the chat about any way to measure the ethical position of a company. Sorry, no, there isn't, because ethics are about people's feelings and people feel differently. So if you look at indexes at the moment of ethical companies, it'll talk about animal welfare, employment rights, environmental impact. Not very many mentions of rights and freedoms in relation to personal data. And different people have different ideas about how to prioritize those. There are some people who would never do business with an organization that has bad environmental impact, but is quite happy for it to mistreat its own workforce, for example. And then other people who would say, animal welfare is the most important thing. That's the only ethical position that matters. So you can't measure ethics from an objective standard. But what an organization can do is identify red flags and green flags that indicate whether or not the organization is functioning according to its own ethical standards and appetite, and develop metrics based on that self-measurement and not make them into targets. Sorry, I lost track because I looked at the chat there. Organization can measure itself against its own expectations, but not against any kind of neutral objective value of ethics, because that simply doesn't exist.
Yeah, thank you, Rowenna. And I think that sums it up. Ultimately, it's impossible to measure ethics, both in terms of an organization and even in your personal life. For instance, it would be very difficult to measure how ethical you are, just as it would be very difficult to measure how ethical an organization is. One thing, though, that you could consider implementing is actively seeking feedback. And Rowenna has touched on this earlier when she talked about making sure you can get feedback from your employees or stakeholders in an anonymous way, because that's always important. If just like the concept of consent, if the feedback you're getting is tainted with the fact that people are aware that if I were to write this, my manager is going to be looking at me with sort of in a different way on Monday morning, then that's probably not a very useful feedback for you. So I would say that you should actively seek out feedback internally within the organization. Do you believe that how we're treating people's personal data is fair to them, is correct, is morally right, safeguards their rights and interests, and also externally, right? So, I mean, if you write a privacy notice and you've had it written by, some of the best lawyers in, the world. I'm a lawyer myself, so, and this is a bit of a diss to lawyers, which I know is very well deserved, right? And you write a privacy notice that, it sounds very nice. It contains all the, clauses that, lawyers like to put in contracts and all of that. And then you're like, oh, this looks very good. Let's put it on the website. But you don't take the time to, run it by just a few of your customers or stakeholders or people who would use that service. You can sometimes end up with a situation like a certain company I'm not going to name ended up in recently where, their privacy notice went viral for all the wrong reasons. And I should say also that, if you're worried about that, we, based on, I'm talking about Zoom, just to be clear. And, it's been in the news, so I'm sure everyone here has seen it, right? Which is an example of what can go wrong if, you do not get feedback because, what that I believe personally could have been avoided if enough people had been allowed to look through that thing and say, oh, I have concerns about this. And they could have just, either clarified or changed whatever they needed to clarify or change and avoided all that bad press. And just to be clear, again, on this webinar, those features in question, like using, recording and training AI, whatever, are not activated. They were never active, but we have also double checked to make sure that they are not active. The call is recorded for the purpose of making it available for, viewing later. Not of the material is being used to train AI or anything like that. So ultimately, like Rowenna has said, there's no objective metric, but you can and should seek feedback internally and externally to be sure that people perceive what you're doing as being right, because it's about emotions, like Rowenna has said, and you want to be sure that people believe you are doing things right. If you get, a preponderance of negative feedback, it's an indication that you need to go back to the drawing board.
And that's really important. And that's a fundamental aspect of data ethics as well, understanding the data. Levels of data understanding, I don't like to say literacy because it sounds really snobby, but understanding what data is, it's a construct. It's stuff we make up to describe the world. It doesn't exist in nature. It's an output of human activity. So, the very first approach to data should always be immense skepticism. What's missing? What's skewed? What's biased? What's inaccurate? How far out of date is it? Because if you treat data as truth, you will never, ever be able to work ethically with it. You've got to treat data like a live velociraptor, pretty much. Don't trust data unless you understand what its limitations are. And this goes to also barriers in organizations, low levels of understanding of what data is and what how it should be worked with. And I'm not talking about statistical analysis, although there needs to be a lot more of understanding of statistical analysis as well. It's things like the origins of the data, the context under which it was generated, what purpose it was generated for, not because the law says so, but because unless you understand those things, you'll never know whether what you're doing with that data is useful, appropriate, effective, damaging, waste of time, pointless. So data understanding, all data, the concept of data, the purpose of data, where it comes from, but also this particular data set. If you don't have people who understand that data at a human level, then the ethics part is going to be a struggle.
Thank you, Rowenna. That's very clear, right? The next item on this slide is end-to-end security but we have a slide. The next slide is the one after this anyway. Is going to be, I'm going to allow Rowenna to speak about this in a bit. It's going to be about how people, process, and technology, work together to aid or defeat data ethics in an organization. Before we do that, though, I wanted to quickly make sure we do not skim over this question someone had asked earlier. And the question was, I'd be really interested to find a way to include ethical considerations into the DPIA process. And I should really appreciate Rowenna's thoughts on that. Ultimately, someone else has tried to answer that question, and I think done very well, saying ethics should be a theme running through the assessments rather than a specific piece of paper. And I agree with that. Ultimately, if you look at the GDPR, there's no specific set of circumstances in which you ought to conduct a DPIA, right? It just says where it is high risk. And ultimately, even though there's been guidance beginning from the Article 29 Working Party to the EDPB to the ICO, the decision to undertake a DPI in the first place is one that should be conducted based on ethics. It would be very easy to just be like, that's not high risk, right? So just go ahead, no need for a DPI, and just, push everything under the rug. But that ethical, stream running through your organization is what should make you, err on the side of caution, because of those hazards Rowenna is going to talk about, and how you need to make sure that you are protecting people's rights, their interests, their freedoms, with how you're processing their personal data. Within the actual assessment itself, it's the same concept, the same set of personal data from the same data subjects being used for the same purpose could have different outcomes in that DPI in the hands of different people, right? So obviously, being ethical means actually putting yourself in the shoes of the people whose data you're processing, to be sure that you are mitigating the risks to them to the best extent, to the most extent possible. And so, Rowenna, if you want to add to that, and then go on to this slide.
Yeah,
I love this slide, by the way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there, Kunbi. The ethics starts with, do I do a DPIA? And if the answer is, it's too much work and it might give us answers we don't want to confront, then congratulations, you failed the ethics test. But then once you get into the DPIA, obviously, as I said earlier, ethics is a big, fuzzy, changeable thing. But if you want the kind of shortcut to having to think, go into philosophy and trolley problems and all that, the baseline for a substitute for doing all that is the 50 fundamental rights and freedoms described in the European Charter of Human Rights. Now, setting aside the fact that the UK government is currently trying to pass a statutory instrument that says, do you know what, we're going to scrap all those, we're going to just point this at UK legislation that we get to make ethics. If you want to do a DPIA based on and for the purpose of protecting people from each other, from unintended adverse consequences, from harm, then the place to start is that list of fundamental human rights. So some of them won't be relevant because they're about voting in European Parliament, but the ones right at the front, they are extremely relevant. The right to life, integrity of person, freedom from torture, fair working conditions, not being discriminated against on certain characteristics. Those are really good ethical guidelines if you don't have the time or energy to come up with your own. And what you're doing is you're not looking at the risk of harm to people. And that's, for example, why I say throw out the word risk and talk about hazards. You're not looking to calculate likelihood and impact. You're looking to see whether or not there are vectors for harms to occur. And if there are, then you need to close down those vectors or put guidelines and safeguards around them so that if they start becoming a path, you can notice that and shut it down. So that kind of thinking at the moment it's not embedded in organizations. DPIAs tend to be commercial infosec risk assessments with DPIA written at the top. Some that do address rights and freedoms limit themselves to data subjects' data protection rights, which, again, that's, if you look at the relevant GDPR article, that's not even the bare minimum of what is required. So yeah, ethics and DPIA go hand in hand, and if you feel that your ethics are aligned with those fundamental human rights that protect people from each other, then that's a good framework to use.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that honestly, there's nothing much to add to that. Rowenna has done the job perfectly, and ultimately, it's, you have a good place to start. The Charter on Human Rights is one that was born out of a long time of extensive negotiation, and it has a long history as well. Trying to distill what the fundamental aspects of humanity are, such that they should be made a priority for all governments within the union. And so starting from there is a great point, and it's something that would likely lead you to make ethical decisions in the course of your DPIA or any other kind of assessment. For instance, and just to speak to the degree of how comprehensive your assessment should be, if you look at people tend to perform international transfer assessments a lot more comprehensively, right? And in those cases, people will go into the, into what the laws are in those countries, what the likelihood is of, again, risk, I know, but what the possibility is that that data could be accessed or misused or abused, and that degree of depth is something that even domestic DPIs should have. Focusing less on 1 to 10, what the likelihood is, and focusing more on if that possibility exists and if it were to occur, what the consequences would be. If that problem exists, if it happens, it's not going to matter to the person whose data has been breached and leaked on the dark web that you thought it was unlikely to happen. And, it's not going to matter to that person. At the end of the day, that person is going to have to face those consequences. So if you were going to put yourself in their shoes, would you be willing to dismiss a risk of 1 on a scale of 1 to 5 as being, practically non-existent? Or would you still try to say, I know it's 1, right, in terms of likelihood based on historical data, but what can we still do to make sure that we, either remove or reduce it to a much lower level, if that's possible? So that's, metrics. And Rowenna, do you want to speak on this slide?
Yes. Yeah. So that whole trying to score risk I have real issues with it, because data harms are what's called a stochastic process. Because of the incredible complexity of all the interactions, there is an element of randomness in the outcomes. So we can predict what will happen, we can predict what will go wrong, but we cannot accurately or reliably predict when, where, to whom, or how. So trying to assess risk as though this were a linear proximate cause effect thing it's pointless. It cannot be done, which is why I choose to look at hazards. For example, the risk that any data set will be misused at some point is 100% likelihood. Like, data exists to be misused because misuse is in the eye of the beholder. So instead of trying to calculate scores for on the basis of imagination and bias, I would say look at these things as though they're hazards. So a hazard is something that is inherently dangerous. The danger can be managed by putting safeguards and controls around it, but without those safeguards and controls, sooner or later, somebody at some point is going to get hurt. You don't need to know who and how and when. You just need to know that this is dangerous, someone's going to get hurt, unless you put blanket protections around it. So things like sorting, ranking, and classifying people. Human beings, we're dominance hierarchy primates. We just love putting each other in boxes and stacking them up in pyramids. That's inherently dangerous, because especially for the people who end up at the bottom of the pyramid. And one day that could be you. So treating, classifying and ranking people with extreme caution is the ethical thing to do. Also, doing anything with those characteristics that have in the past been used to justify atrocities. We call them special categories of personal data in the language of data protection law. And the reason they exist is that they are the characteristics that the Third Reich datafied using IBM punch cards in order to identify and eliminate people with those characteristics. They're like the third rail of humanity. So sexual orientation, sexuality, religion or faith, political opinions, trade union membership, genetics, disability, all these things are lessons learned from the past that if you don't put guardrails around these, people will get hurt. And then programmatic advertising and algorithmic targeting. So what happened with Facebook there was that they started off with doing blatant racial profiling. So people profiled as African American in the US were not getting to see ads for housing opportunities, financial support, high-paying jobs, high-value goods, because it was assumed that because the overall demographic is less economically advantaged, that no single individual in that demographic group was worth the time or effort. So Facebook shut that down. They pulled those criteria out of the algorithm, but actually the effect persisted because the algorithm was looking to exclude people who would not provide a great return on investment. And because of social history, that still turns out to be marginalized and minoritized groups. So algorithmic profiling and programmatic advertising are also a hazard. Trying to block bulk content is another one. This goes right to the whole problem with ethics. There are people out there who believe genuinely and sincerely that there is only one standard model for valid humanity, and that if you don't conform to that model, there's something wrong with you. So, for example, they have problems with LGBTQ people because they don't fit that very narrow model of what they think humans should be. And because of that, anything that's related to LGBTQ relationships gets seen as wrong or dirty or more sexual than it actually is. And that results in people with the best of intentions trying to safeguard children by preventing young queer children from being able to access support and educational resources. Surveillance is always a hazard because it sets up an inherent power imbalance. The person doing the watching always has more power than the person being watched, especially if the person being watched doesn't know they're being watched, because being watched affects how you behave, how you think, what you show, what you do. Surveillance also is generally weaponized first against people with the least social power. So surveillance should be treated as though it's inherently a hazard. There is nothing safe about surveillance unless safety is actively designed, put in, maintained, and sustained. So this and the Apple Card didn't see gender, as in it didn't have a specific field for what gender identity does this person claim. What it did was it looked at historical earnings. And because of the history of social change in in the data set it was looking at a data set that up until only very recently, women were allowed to have jobs without having to get their husband's permission, or women were even hired to do jobs at all. So while the Apple Card, the credit limit, wasn't using gender as a specific input, it was nonetheless influenced by gender. So historical data sets, and this goes back to what I was saying about understanding the data. If you take a historical data set and assume that it is reflective of the world as it should be, not as it has been, then you're instantly taking on a hazard. So that's a very, very quick speed run through the concept of hazards, which is unpacked a lot more in the DPAS data ethics course.
Thank you, Rowenna. Ultimately, personally, I think there are a couple of things there. The first one is that, there are a number of things that by themselves pose, higher risks and hazards than other things, which means, therefore, that if you come across those things, you ought to be a bit more skeptical, more cautious in how you implement them. And secondly, sometimes it might be necessary to peel the onion, so to speak, to go, to look at what the data set, where it's from, how it was acquired, what it represents, as opposed to what it purports to represent. And, actually find out what the impacts might be, beyond, whether the decision to give someone a credit card or not, how that might be based on faulty data and how it might impact them negatively through no fault of their own. But very quickly now, in terms of, I think we've covered a lot of the process. We've covered how to, and also people, how to get, buy-in, how to engage with your staff, how to engage with stakeholders, the users, data subjects, and, people involved. I think the only thing we need to touch on from this slide is on technology. So my question is, I know we can talk about technology all day long in terms of what tools to use, but I'm just going to give you a one from left field, right? I'm going to ask you, at PrivSec, there was a debate of sorts about how useful AI tools could be for data protection. So I'm going to ask you, how useful do you think that AI tools are for data ethics? Are there any that you know of? And, what would you be looking at?
Well, fundamentally, a tool can only ever be as useful as the competency of the person applying it and the suitability for the job which it's being applied to. So there's a hard limit on usefulness, and that's, who's using it and what for. Having said that, if you have, if you are a person who understands data, data, the concept as well as the specific data, have a genuine commitment to not doing avoidable harm, and have the resources, like the time and thinking space, to be able to apply tools effectively, then the answer is enormously helpful. So tools include the Open Data Institute's Data Ethics Canvas, and I'm not just saying that because they're the people who certified me. It is actually a genuinely useful tool. There's ethicalOS.org has a framework for identifying, well, they call them risk zones, I call them hazards. There's the what are they called? Damn, should have written that down. There's a non-profit company, social enterprise, that has an agile framework for having ethics discussions, and I'll drop the link afterwards because I can't remember it off the top of my head. Sorry. And then there are lots and lots of frameworks out there, and then there's also the classic trolley problem. If you're looking at sacrificing a couple of minoritized and marginalized data subjects for the benefit of shareholders, then that is an ethics tool, visualizing that. It can't tell you the answer. None of these tools can tell you the answer. That's really important. They're not they're not machines that you can put raw ingredients into and get cakes out of. They're tools to help you think and work through the process. So yeah, definitely have a look at those.
Thank you very much, Rowenna. And that brings us to the end of the discussion. It has been a very interesting discussion. Every time I sit in on one of Rowenna's presentations, it's always, so enlightening, always, become a new convert, so to speak, into the data ethics school of thought. And that's been very helpful. Unfortunately, we can't have, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, just because we literally have 1 minute left to finish this. So very quickly, in terms of what DPAS does, I've covered that already in terms of how we can help with your data ethics, the documentation, the analysis, the training, the policies, making sure that people like Rowenna can, give excellent training to your staff to make them fully aware of how best they can help and support your implementation of data ethics. So these are some of the training courses that we have coming up. And the largest one on October 18th, that's the nearest date, for data ethics course, for our data ethics course, is going to be led by Rowenna. And if you want to hear more about her, data hazards, which I've found to be a very interesting prism with which to perform data protection functions, be sure to book on that. We have a number of other ones, and some have discounts on at the moment, so it's the perfect time to get signed up to them. Thank you very much for joining. We appreciate your presence. We appreciate your staying through to the end. Thank you very much, Rowenna. As always, it has been very educative. Thank you for sharing from your wealth of insight. Thank you, everyone. We're going to send a survey at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to share your thoughts, your opinions about what we've discussed today. And if you have any feedback for us, we're very welcome. So we do it ethically. We go out and seek feedback, and that's what we're going to be doing. So please make sure to send in your thoughts to us. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, everyone.